Okay, so good morning, good afternoon, hello everybody, and welcome to Office Hours. It's the end of the month, or the last session in the month, so we're going to do a special topic session. I apologize if there's too much noise in the background. I'll try and keep muting myself, but we're in a hotel lobby just having finished the MPSP, and HEDA community sprint, and we thought some other people might be joining us, but I think everybody's heading off for hotels, for airports and things. Anyway, today we're going to talk about, yes, thank you, Rie Community Sprint. Okay, somebody's joining us from somewhere. So today we're going to talk about profiles and permission sets, and we've got some great experts on this to help and answer your questions, tell you about, share some of their tips and advice. So I'd just like to remind everybody that none of us work for Salesforce.org. We volunteer our time and our talents because we enjoy sharing knowledge about Salesforce. So please don't ask us too many complicated questions about features that may be coming up. We don't need to do the safe harbor. And the other thing is, if you've not attended office hours before, or even if you have, just a reminder, the way that this works is that if you have a question for us, then please put it in the chat first. That sort of helps us to see what's coming up, and then we'll get to your questions in the order that they're asked. Since there are a lot of you on the call, everybody's being pretty good at the moment. Please mute yourself. As I say, I'm probably the one who's going to cause background noise today, and I will do my best to minimize that. But it helps if everyone else is muted, unless, of course, you're answering a question, or we've actually asked you to unmute to talk to us. So these special topic sessions are a little bit different because we try and focus the questions to the topic, and we also try and do a bit of show and tell as well. So feel free, if you've got questions about profiles and permission sets, to put them in the chat. But otherwise, I think we'll start the conversation a little bit, just talking about what they are. And yeah. Oh, okay. Yeah. All right. TJ's got headset problems, so she's going back upstairs. So that's all right. We'll see you in a few minutes then. All right. Thank you, TJ. Heidi and Sarah, it's over to you, I think. So there's a reason, of course, a connection kind of between profiles and permission sets. And
start, Caroline.
Hello. Hello, was somebody, did somebody want to ask me a question?
I think did you cut out just for a second, Caroline? Did you want us to talk about just kind of the definition of each to start, or?
Yes, so it's interesting that, I'm sorry that I cut out. Okay, so yes, that's kind of what I was getting to, that there is a connection between the two, and obviously they're both to do with security, but let's talk a little bit about what each one is, and then we can talk about connection and why you might use one rather than the other. So I think most people, when they're thinking about Salesforce security, often start with the profile. So what can you do with a profile? What does it help with in terms of security? Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So the thing about profiles and permission sets is that they're both part of a larger set of security measures that Salesforce provides you. So so profiles allow you to really get to the nitty-gritty of who can do what, and who can see what, and what permissions people have. Whereas sharing settings are more about whose records can you see. This is more about functionality settings of what can you do and what can you see in a kind of more binary fashion. So all of the CRUD permissions are set of administrative and system settings as well. And then there's also areas where you can assign Apex and Visual Force files to various people. And then permission sets are essentially the same exact set of features. Gives you the ability to apply that to individuals as opposed to, and also sets of people in a kind of smaller, more limited fashion.
It's interesting, isn't it? Profiles are about there's, as you say, Sarah, there's things sort of specifically at the object level, and there's also some quite generic stuff as well. Things to do with passwords and which bits of Salesforce you can do and what kind of actions and what you can manage and things like that. Yeah, Heidi, do you want to talk a little bit more about some of the things you can do with a profile?
Yes, please. So the difference between a profile and a permission set is profiles can be used to assign, as Caroline was alluding to, business hours. So if you want to lock a certain set of users out during certain business hours, you can use a profile to do that. Also, profiles are used to assign page layouts. You can't do that with a permission set. So profile is kind of in my use of them with clients, I use a profile as your baseline access, as Sarah mentioned, to your CRUD, your create, read, edit, delete. Permission sets I use to extend that permission out. And again, this is for if your organization-wide defaults are set to anything other than public read write, profiles and permission sets control access to the records you own. So that's really, I think, the trickiest part of sharing.
I was just looking to, I was just about navigating my way to a profile page so that we could have a look at it and dig in a little bit.
And I think you cut out again.
Did I? I'm sorry about that.
Yeah.
Okay, that's fine. Well, I hope. Can you hear me at all? Sandy is saying, yes, you can now. Good. All right. I'm just cutting in and out a bit.
Yes.
All right. There we go. Okay. Yes, the hazards of hotel Wi-Fi. And on the day when you're not in the conference, actually, it worked for the sprint. So I guess we can't complain. So, yeah, I was just thinking, I mean, profiles are interesting, aren't they? Because everybody has to have or you have to assign a profile to all of your Salesforce users, don't you? It's like that's the kind of compulsory bit of settings of
the meat of what you just said. Heidi, do you hear her, or is it, or no?
No.
Okay, great. Well, it's so silent when we keep losing her that I'm like, is it me? Or is it... Okay.
I'm glad that you can all hear Sarah, because Sarah keeps cutting out on me. That's the thing. So I'm going silent because I'm not sure whether you're still talking, Sarah.
I was like, can we hear Caroline? Can we not? I can't tell. That's all I was saying. But we haven't heard we haven't heard the content of anything you've said yet. So.
Oh, what a bummer. Okay. All right. What I was trying to say is that a profile is it's necessary, isn't it? It's one of the things that you have to assign to any user. Some of these other things are optional, but a profile is required.
Right. And there's actually a good deal of design involved. So as a consultant, you know, one of the things that you have to figure out is how are you going to design the profiles? How many are you going to make? Who are they going to be for? How are you going to split them? Are you going to give some people permissions they may not need because it doesn't hurt? Are you going to instead make that 2 profiles? The thing is that you really have to balance the number of profiles against the maintainability, because the more profiles you make, the harder it is to maintain. And so generally, as a rule of thumb, what I think most consultancies do is that what you do is you try to minimize the number of profiles. Not to the point where people really can't do their jobs, but I think, you know, definitely what we do is we try to have the fewest restrictions, except, you know, to run your business. So if people aren't supposed to see opportunities because only the finance team sees them, well, then they shouldn't see opportunities. But if there's no real rule against other people seeing them, and it's fine, they just won't be using them, you know, we wouldn't choose then to kind of split a profile based on that access. So generally what we say is lock down the permissions as little as possible. You know, just do what you need to do to meet your actual business needs. And then you can always lock things down further in the future. A lot of times people choose to have kind of, you know, we'll usually start out with a base of 2 profiles, not counting the sysadmin. So there's always a sysadmin profile because that is a standard profile. And then we will make custom profiles where we usually have like a power user profile and then a more regular user profile, where you kind of give more people delete permissions, say, in a power user profile than you would in just kind of the common everyday user profile. And then permission sets are a way of extending that. So if you have 20 people who all share a profile and 2 of them need to be able to merge contacts and none of the others have delete on contacts, then you would make a permission set to additively give permissions. You can't remove permissions with a permission set. That's one of the biggest things that people get confused about. They think, oh, but I gave you a permission set that doesn't have delete access, so now you can't delete. It doesn't work that way. Permission sets are only additive. So you can only give additional permissions in permission sets. You cannot remove permissions from permission sets. And I think the last thing, because I can hear Caroline's question in my head, is just talking a little bit about the fact that Salesforce provides standard profiles out of the box for people to use. And then Salesforce also allows you to clone profiles, to clone the standard profiles to make custom ones. And so generally what I've seen is that people out of the box use the sysadmin profile pretty commonly. And then generally most other profiles people use will be cloned. It's uncommon that people will use the standard profiles for content, for like the marketing or for any of the other kind of roles that they put in, just because they're not usually all that, you know, similar to what you actually need. And you can't edit them. So the thing about the standard profile is that it is as it comes. And so if you want to make changes, you clone it and make your own copy. So.
And
how did you do that, Sarah? Was it precisely going to be my next question? Was about
there's a clone button on the profile, on the standard profiles that you can use. We'll usually start out with one of the profiles that has like we either start out with sysadmin and take things out of it, or we start out with a lower one and put things back into it. But that's we'll usually start out, especially when you're building out a system and you haven't yet deployed it and gone live yet. When you're in the middle of building something, it's a good idea to really just start with one profile for everybody. And then as they're testing the system and using it and seeing it, you can then kind of branch it out from there. But we usually try to start with only one so that we're not maintaining a large number of profiles throughout a build process.
And this is TJ, and I'm actually more stringent with my profiles. I usually start by deleting all of the NPSP custom ones and try to only have 2 whenever possible, the sysadmin and cloned standard. and with the clone standard, start with the bare minimum access of the most limited user. What do they need access to? And apply that to that cloned standard user, and then use permission sets to add on top of that of your power users or any additional things like that. But what Felice mentioned in the comments is needing profiles to apply to page layouts. And that's an important piece of profiles. Whenever possible, as long as I can use the same frame of the page layout and it's really just what appears on it. If they shouldn't be seeing it at all, I just hide that from the standard profile and give additional permissions via permission set. But when it's truly like you have a data entry screen that has to be completely different than a standard user versus like the place where they are is different on the page layouts, then yes, throwing in a different profile so that you can assign a profile to a page layout, because page layouts are assigned at the profile level. So even with page layouts, I try to minimize the profiles as much as possible and just use those profiles to hide what they shouldn't see. But if it truly is a different page layout structure, then that's when you start adding more, that's when I start adding more profiles in, because just what like record types and managing those, I try to minimize those whenever possible. So profiles are the same way. They're just such a pain to maintain that I try to keep it as few as possible and just apply permission sets on top of those.
So that's interesting. I hope you can hear me. There's an interesting question just in this: how many profiles should you create? The question from Kimberly, which is actually a Heidi question, but I think applies in a similar way. She says that they have a small department, 10 people. They haven't yet set up any custom profiles but they need one for student staff who might help entering lead data and not have access to their contacts. And so she's wondering about best practices in creating profiles. Again, if somebody has a specific need, would you approach this by creating the specific profile and then having a more generic one?
I certainly would. I mean, if there are people that have extremely restricted access that just can only do like one thing like that, I would definitely make them a profile. I would not try to take a base profile with basically nothing in it and then try to put 700 permission sets on top of it. I don't think that would make sense. I mean, the thing you have to keep in mind about permission sets is that, and I've seen it before, where they can proliferate like mad, and then you have and because of people's like poor nomenclature or tweaking them without kind of updating the description of what's happening in them, you wind up with like 700 permission sets, and nobody has any idea what they're for. So I would caution that while permission sets are extremely useful, you also want to be able to make sure that you understand what's in a permission set and how it's being applied to various people. So I think that if you have somebody who just is supposed to do stuff with leads, just make a really limited profile for like that very specific use case.
Yeah, and similar to being good with fields and making sure that you have descriptions, both profiles and permission sets, make sure you have a description in there of what it's doing, especially permission sets, so that you don't have to try, because unless you switch back to like classic, there's no real easy way to quickly look at a permission set to say what it does.
I just had to reverse engineer like 5 permission sets, and I can tell you that it took like 4 hours to go through because they're laid out in such a terrible way that
you really want to put in that description, like not just so like if it's named power user, put in the description what are those additional things that you're giving to this person. And whenever possible, don't make a permission set just for like one permission. Try to group them into groups, sometimes you do have to have like a permission set with one permission, like it may have two, like an API user might have password never expires an API, and because that's something that you don't want to apply to very few people and it's very limited. So, but usually you try to group permission sets with groups of permissions and use that description religiously.
Yeah,
That's great.
along the lines of that, I would just say that and I don't know if other people do this because I don't really ask other people, but like we keep the long layout for profiles. We do not use the quote unquote enhanced view of profiles because there's nothing enhanced about it. It just means that it's going to take you 75 times longer to do something with it. So I don't know if you wanted to show them, Caroline, or not, but there's a setting that that you can where you can choose whether or not you're using the enhanced profile layout, and we always turn that off so that you see every single permission on just one long page with the profile instead of having to go back and forth between that little pull down and trying to see things on bunches of different screens.
And I just posted a link to the Perm Comparator, which is a free app that you can use to actually compare permission sets. And it'll tell you what's the same, what's different, same thing, I'm sorry, with profiles as well. And that can be a really good tool if you inherit or you're starting with an org that the permission sets or the profiles are truly out of control. And you just want to know, like, okay, how are these actually different? Instead of having to poke through and manually look, you can use that tool and say, compare these, and it breaks it down to here's the same, here's what's different. It's an amazing tool. And that's in the chat for the link if you like.
That's great. Thank you. I think let's just dig a little bit more into the difference between profiles and permission sets because we're bouncing around a little bit. So what's a really good use case then for permission sets? I think Heidi, yeah, you'd kind of suggested some things in email to me.
Yeah, an approach that I've been taking with permission sets is in order to limit the number of profiles, I have been taking what I'm calling an app-based approach to permission sets. So basically what I did is I have the profile pretty open with access to most objects, and then granting access to the app that appears in the app picker via permission set. So that means that your users still have access to, let's say you have an app for your fund development folks and you have an app for your programs folks. You can grant access to all of those objects and then use permission sets to make the fund development app pop up for fund development folks and the programs app pop up for programs folks. So it's just kind of a design decision that involves permission sets that makes it a little bit cleaner to manage that app-based permission set for different types of users while still keeping your profiles limited.
I wonder if Caroline's there. Oh, there she is.
Yeah, I think that's quite an interesting approach, isn't it? Because also sometimes there are apps that would go across roles or functions, aren't there? I mean, like if you can accept online payments, for example.
Yeah, exactly. And then you can just, because permission sets are assigned at the user level, you can have users that traverse roles. So assigning the payment processor to maybe a power user who has access to the fund development, the payment processor app, and the programs app.
So there's a one follow-up question to yes, this cool approach. Let's talk about this a little bit. Can using these permission sets cause problems with access to objects and fields in reporting? Sarah, just yes, please explain to everyone what you've just put in chat.
Oh yeah, sure. So they were basically just asking that they're saying that's a cool approach and wondering if that affects like what people can see for reporting. And I said that because of how you described it, it wouldn't, because you're leaving the object access open in the profile. So everybody has access to the objects, to the tabs, to the fields, but they just don't have the convenience of having the app with the tabs in it that they can flip to. But that means that because they have access to the objects, when they go into reporting, they'll see all of them. When they go into the tab picker, they'll see the tabs. So it depends on what the tab settings are in the profile, but they likely will see the tabs. They just don't have the convenience of the app that wraps the tabs. Apps really are nothing except a collection of tabs. They
Exactly.
kind of they literally do nothing else except give you a logo and a collection of tabs. So she's just using this as kind of a convenience mechanism to be able to group tabs together for people who are using kind of that set frequently.
Exactly.
I just made 2 permission sets yesterday, actually. I made a permission set for a client that has about 60 users, and they do accreditation management, and they do not let people delete records in general. The sysadmin has that permission. Generally, other people do not, because they don't have the only reason you would be deleting something really would be for duplicate management, or if you have made a mistake. And so they don't generally let people delete things. So I made a permission set for merging contacts, because in order to merge contacts, you need to be able to delete contacts, because one or more of the contacts that you're merging is actually getting deleted. So you need to give like a modify all on contact. And so I gave a permission set with modify all on contact to 2 people who are going to be able to merge contacts for them, because it turned out the sysadmins were becoming a bottleneck for it. A lot of times when it comes to destructive changes like deletes, you won't give people permission to do that out of the gate. And then when you kind of get a feel for how often people need it and what the use cases are around it, you can then kind of additively give back in permissions around it. And another one I did was around finance, where they wanted finance people to be able to have greater access to deleting and editing opportunities than everybody else. And so we gave finance a special permission set as well.
Yeah, I think that's those sorts of restricting deletion. It's a really great one if you've got volunteers working with your organization, isn't it? Make sure they can't delete any records. So if they mess up, you know what's happening. Yeah, there was it was a good question from Ari, thank you, about the way to do page assignments. Heidi, do you want to talk a little bit more about that? Because page assignments, I think, is not really something you could control with a permission set, is it?
Correct. Yeah. So maybe one day we will be able to assign page layouts some other way other than the profile. But that is one thing you do need a profile for. This is something in the beginning we said there is a lot of design decisions you need to make when you're setting up your security model in the beginning. Page layouts, I would really focus on the why when you're starting to talk to your users about, oh, I need a different page layout. Do they really need a different page layout, or can they use a collapsible section, or do they even need to see those fields on the screen? Because if you have, let's say you have 10 users and each of those 10 users wants to see a different page layout. No, you don't want to have 10 profiles for 10 users. So that's just something that you can't get around. You have to use a profile to assign a page layout.
Cool. There was a question. I think we've touched on it a couple of times. This confusion a little bit between profiles and permission sets being about objects and what happens to individual records. I'm looking at Alyssa's question about sharing rules for volunteers for Salesforce. I mean, you can talk about that a little bit, but that's interesting because it's not the profile really that governs that, is it?
No, the sharing rules and profiles are two entirely separate areas of security. So sharing rules have to do with whose records you can see, and the permission sets are the what. The what can you see and what can't you see at a kind of more binary level. So can you see opportunities? Can't you? And then sharing settings are all about whose opportunities can you see or not see. And so the sharing rules are completely different.
And I believe, Alyssa, that there's, in terms of your private, you have there's a problem with private sharing rules on volunteers for Salesforce, that it will create duplicates, unfortunately, when new people sign up. So you have to take a slightly different approach. Let's do Ryan's question about public groups and where they might fit in, and then I'm Julia, I'm going to ask you a little bit more about why you want to see view donations. We'll talk about that a bit. But Ryan's question: public groups, how do they fit into this?
I can take that one.
Yeah, you can take that. It's fine.
I've used public groups in the past to share out report folders, and I've used public groups in sharing rules. So if you do have a private security model, I like to use public groups rather than the role hierarchy, just because I think it is easier to understand and easier to manage. So sharing rules are basically automatically sharing out records based on what you define. So if you're using a public group, you can decide who to put in that group. So much more easily than you can change their level on the role hierarchy or modify a sharing rule. So I use it as kind of a safeguard and a more visible, manageable way to control access to records using sharing rules. Also, public groups can be used in sending emails. So you can email to a public group. So it's kind of doing double duty.
Yeah, I'd say that's the majority of use that we have around well, we have two main uses for public groups, but one is definitely around notifications. So all the time clients will say, we want the accreditation services team to receive notifications when this happens, or we want the development team to receive notifications when this happens, or we want the whoever's to get this thing. And so you just make a group groups are really just buckets. All they are is a collection of people with a name. And so we basically are just making buckets for them. So you're making a bucket for the finance team, or you're making a bucket for accreditation services. And every time they're supposed to be notified of something, either through a workflow or a process builder or whatever it is, you can just use that public group to receive the notification. And then when the personnel actually change, you just make one change in one place instead of having to change out 75 workflow rules.
And that's interesting.
And the other place we use it, which is more, oh, sorry, go ahead, Caroline.
No, and I was just saying that, I mean, this is kind of going away from profile slightly, isn't it? Just to be clear about it, because we're talking about access to particular types of record. So public groups is a part of kind of other sharing rules, not necessarily governed by profile.
Right. Public groups are really just a bucketing mechanism. They themselves don't actually really do anything. They're a way to bucket people to then use it in other areas.
Cool, thank you. So yes, thank you, Maida, for reposting your question, because yes, I did notice it come in right at the beginning, and I realize it's quite specific, but it would be a good one to talk about. So if you look at the question from Maida, that she'd like to create a profile that's basically view only, but has permission to log a call. Is this possible? And it's for a volunteer, and they don't want to allow them to be able to modify records, but they would like them to be able to log activities.
I think let me actually just like look at one quickly. I think that you can't have, I don't think you can have write on a task, which is what a log a call is an activity or a task. I think that you can't have write on a task if you don't have write on its parent. But oh, actually, edit tasks is a general user permission. I take it back. It depends on how your sharing settings are set up, but edit tasks is a general user permission. So you should be able to give them edit tasks and not have access to edit the parent record of it. I can't say I've ever tried that, but it is one of the general user permissions on the profile, edit tasks. And logging a call as a task.
I think I should swap back to you're right about the not enhanced profile thing, because I never can find my way around it either.
No.
Okay, so you're right, there's a specific permission there for tasks. And then you would need to go to the objects themselves to control what you can do with them.
Right. Yeah, there's not a client I work with where I don't immediately go to user management settings and switch the profile back to the classic view, because it's like, why would you want to have to do about 60 clicks instead of one? Like, it just, from a UX perspective, just does not make sense to me. So that's just me.
Sorry, yes, I was on mute, and I have done this exact thing for a client that wanted their program folks to just have read-only on accounts, contacts, and opportunities, but be able to log a call against all of them. And by just giving them read-only access to the objects, they can, and having edit tasks, they can log calls to any of those records that they have view access to, as long as it's on the page layout.
Do you see, TJ, Sandy's got a kind of thing, he says, can you access chatter separately as well as logging a call? Anybody know?
I haven't tried to access chatter separately. I want to say yes, because chatter has a tendency to just be everywhere.
Yeah, chatter is controlled by licensing. It's not controlled. I mean, pieces of it are controlled by the profile. The base chatter is controlled by licensing, not by profiles. Yeah. And every license type has it, basically.
Yeah.
Okay, let's go back to Julia Sampson's question, where Julia, you said, can you open the view donations permission on the screen, because you said you wanted to do the opposite. Explain to us what you mean by the opposite.
Actually, I would like to, we have employees and then we have part-time contractors. I would like to make sure the part-time contractors don't have access to donor information, the opportunities.
Yeah, so you can't take away permissions from with a permission set. They cannot be destructive. They can only be additive. And what you're talking about is no access. So there's nothing additive about that. That's only taking away. That's just nothing. So you would want to have a profile for them that has no access to opportunities. I mean, you could have one profile that has no access to opportunities and then give access to opportunities via a permission set. But the reality is that contractors probably have many other things that are different than employees. And to me, that's like a pretty logical split for why you would have two profiles. Not nearly as onerous as the maintenance on, say, page layouts. So when you're talking about proliferating page layouts, it's immediate pain, because as soon as you add one new field, having to add it into 10 new page layouts is atrocious. But you know, the maintenance that you do on profiles isn't so onerous that like 2 is really a problem. I have a client that has like 35 profiles, and that really gets into, you know, a little bit of a nightmare of trying to understand who's doing what. But you know, I mean, just 1 or 2 or even like 4, I think is not, you know, you don't really need to be concerned about that.
Got it. I think I see clearer now. Thanks so much. Thanks.
Sure.
Yeah, and Julia, just be aware that, of course, the totals will be visible. If they can see the contact and account page, they'll be able to see the total that somebody's donated, because those are up on that page. But it's just obviously the detail of the donations if you remove access to opportunities.
Yeah, so in that profile, you might, if they really shouldn't see that too, you would want to go into the contacts, into field level security in the profile, and take out their ability to view those kind of aggregate fields that summarize from the opportunity. I think if it's a roll up, you wouldn't have been able to see it, but because the MPSP uses triggers to write the data, it's different.
So, so I guess that goes to sort of Ari's question. If you deny access to an object via a profile, will that automatically deny access to those fields?
Yes, that is what that is.
Okay.
Oh, but I don't know what you mean by those fields, but if you mean the fields on the object that you denied access to, yes. Yeah, fields on the object, yeah.
Great, great. Yeah, Kimberly, this marketing user profile and market checkbox in the profile users for marketing user. Yeah, we all get confused about that, I think. Thank you for answering, Heidi. The question about integration users, and Kevin's question, if you're using something like form assembly, is it what do you advise panel? Is it best practice to lock everything down through a profile or a permission set?
With
We
integration.
usually, oh, go ahead.
Oh, go ahead.
I was going to say just the method that I use in my in working with my clients. I usually recommend having an API user profile and an API user assigned to your integrations for 2 reasons. The profile should be restricted to only the fields and objects that API user should be modifying. And if you have the licenses, available, having an API user specific to your integration helps you keep track of what that user is doing in your system. It helps you audit what is automatically being updated. So you can restrict it by the profile, and you can keep track of it, monitor it by using a separate user.
Yeah, and to add on to that, I think, you know, we don't even give our clients, we don't really give the option of not having an API user as a separate user, because 1, you don't want the password to ever expire. So you want to put a permission set on that user that has a no password expiring, because otherwise you're going to run into problems where your integrations suddenly are not working and no one knows why, and it's because the password expired. The other thing is that you probably want to mark it as API only, which means that that user can only access the API. They can't actually log into Salesforce. And so if you were using someone else's user also to be the user that you're using with form assembly or, you know, whichever other integration, you can't lock that down, or else that other person who's using it wouldn't be able to log in. So we don't necessarily lock down the permissions on our API user profile. Usually we don't get into object level security with it, because an app is going to use Salesforce in the way it uses it. And if you have only apps that are using your API user, you don't necessarily need to worry about them running amok, because they have very specific things that they do. So this API enabled here, and then API only user underneath it. API only user only allows them to authenticate via the API. It does not let them log in. So a lot of times for troubleshooting, we'll let them log in, because they'll say, oh, our app isn't working, we need to look. And then as soon as it's kind of ironed out, we lock it down to API only user.
And another reason to have it be its own user record is because you can exclude it from your duplicate management rules. Because if you have duplicate management rules in place to alert, so when you're entering in a new contact account, whatever, and it does that little pop-up of, hey, do you want to use this record? It looks like you're trying to create something that already exists. With an API connection, that gets passed to the API and the integration fails. It won't. It takes that message as an error message, and it won't complete the sync. So having it be its own user, you can say, have all of these matching rules in place, but only if the user alias or the username or the user ID is not the API account, so that it lets the API do what it needs to do, and you handle that duplicate management as maintenance, because having it error out is more problematic than an occasional duplicate that you can just handle in regular maintenance.
Right. Or you have to set your duplicate management to warn instead of error, which is another way to get around that. But then you don't actually get errors any other time.
And Maida's question about using the same API user for all integrations, that really depends on how many integrations you have and what they're doing. If you have two integrations that are creating a lot of contacts and editing a lot of things, you might want to split that into two user records so that you can see, and if you ever need to troubleshoot, which of those integrations is actually creating those records or editing something that is getting funky. But I have some clients that use the same admin or web or integration user for all of their integrations, for like a form assembly or a MailChimp. But if you want the ease of really being able to look at the record and know exactly what edited it or created it, then you would want to split those integrations into its own user. In a best case scenario, every integration would have its own user record if you have the licenses. If you don't have the licenses, at least pay for one for that integration user, and don't share it, because everything that Sara said.
Yeah, and our clients only ever use one integration user for everything. We generally deal with troubleshooting during build, and then it's, most of our clients don't want to pay the money to have more API users. I haven't found a problem with like who's creating this record, who's creating that record out of integrations, and we do really extensive integrations. But if you have extra licenses floating around, I'm sure it can't hurt.
Great, thanks for that advice. So a good question from John F., which maybe will keep us going for a little bit. When do you decide to do a full-on refactoring of profiles? I've avoided this because it's hard, and instead I just keep making a mishmash of what?
Oh, there you're back.
You were dropping out. Okay, all right. I'm doing John F.'s question, the full-on refactoring of profiles. I've avoided this because it's hard, and instead keep making a mishmash of more profiles and permission sets.
I would always be refactoring. I mean, I wouldn't call it refactoring, but I would always be making sure that I'm not adding new profiles when new people come in, and evaluating why the profiles are there. I think you wind up in kind of a bad situation like you're probably experiencing if you just keep making more profiles when more people come in. I think also the reality is that usually a lot of people can get away with the same profile and never notice a difference. So, you know, we try to stick with kind of a couple of base profiles that someone's just going to naturally fit mostly in, and then you can always adjust with permission sets. But I would always make sure that you know who is in your profiles and what they are doing, and so that when someone comes in, you know how to kind of fit them in the slot.
Yeah, John, I would agree with Sarah on that one. It sounds like you might be experiencing a bit of a security spaghetti mess. And it might be time to take an org-wide approach, and instead of creating new profiles, maybe start looking at deleting some of those profiles, cutting down, combining some of them.
Yeah.
TJ mentioned the perm comparator, Heroku app. That's a really good one to start seeing which profiles can be combined together, which permission sets actually have unique permissions in them. But what I would do, and yes, it is hard, it's very hard, is start with your organization's philosophy on security. Do they really need all of those restrictions? I would start with that question.
Yeah, and I see a question here from Ryan. The record types, so say you have donations and you have event registrations, which are obviously two different things, and you want to restrict access to viewing the different record types, so someone can only see a donation or only see an event registration. He's asking if this requires the use of sharing rules. The answer is yes, it does. Do not be fooled by the record type section in the profiles that where you can add and remove record types. That is not visibility of a record type. That is, can you create a record of that record type or not? So if you go to the record type section and you take out a record type for someone, that just means they won't see it in the list of record types when they go to create a new record. It does not mean anything about viewing the records of those record types. So if you need to split it, you would need to do probably a criteria-based sharing rule, I'm guessing, where you would basically have a sharing rule that says if the record type is this, then share it with this group, and this would be potentially a good use of public groups in this scenario, where you might make one group that gets to view event registrations, another group that gets to view donations, and then you would do two criteria-based sharing rules on the opportunities to say who, you know, which group can see which records. And you would need to have a private model at that point to be able to do that.
Which we'll come back to in a whole nother session, I think. Lisa's question, where do I see which account is assigned to each integration?
Which account is assigned to which integration? What does that mean?
You actually can't you have to look at your integration and see what account is set up. For instance, if you're using form assembly, you have to log into form assembly and check your each form's connector settings to see what user account it's using. Sometimes, depending on the integration, it might use whatever user is used to install it. So the easiest way to find out what user is using what integration is to do something in that integrated tool and have it sync and see what user is tagged as a creator or editor. there's really no way in this, like the Salesforce setup, say like, oh, this user is getting used at this, and this. You have to check it on the integration side of things, or have it do something and check the Salesforce record that it touched.
Yeah, and a lot of them, they will have settings pages inside Salesforce, and so you can go look at the settings page in Salesforce. Like Box.com, for example, has a settings page in Salesforce that you can look at. So sometimes it just is wherever you configure the tool, but it's on the tool side. It is not in the Salesforce. It is not Salesforce's side.
Do we have any more questions?
I think I saw a question in the beginning about how to log, not really log, but how to document and track profiles and permission sets. Does anyone have any best practices there that they would want to share of once you create them, how you document what is what and who should be assigned to who?
My best practice has
Yeah, go
always
ahead.
been documenting within the description fields. That's really going to be your best bet. Documenting your system within the system is for time-strapped admins who can't spend, you know, hours and hours and hours creating a document that nobody's ever going to read. Putting the reason why you've created that profile, who it's for, what it's doing in the description is really what I would recommend as a baseline. Additional documentation is kind of gravy.
Yeah, I like to have a chatter group that I call like system or instance documentation, that I will, if there's a particular type of user that needs to have a very specific set of profile permission set or whatever, or if I'm just documenting like why we did something that was not best practices, of just creating a post in that chatter group of, if you're creating this type of user, make sure you do this, 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 and this, because then it's searchable. You can see who posted it and what time. And if that user goes away, it's still there. You don't have to find it in their network drive folders or their email or their Google Docs. It's just having that single chatter group with just posts of either important decisions or short little process descriptions, I think is really helpful, because then you can just really quickly search for something, and especially if it's something that you don't do a lot.
That's a great point, TJ. Thank you for that. And Kimberly, Kimberly is kind of reaffirming what she thought she heard at the start of the call. Creating profiles, start by cloning the system admin for more permissions or the standard user for minimum, and organize all other standard profiles. I think that was you, Sarah. Was that your recommended best practice?
Yes.
Absolutely. Great. Thank you. Well, thank you, everybody. Thank you for some good questions. Sorry about some audio issues. Made a limited licenses available and want to share with 1 or 2 users. Volunteers, can you switch profiles? I think bring that one to the hub. That might bring, that's kind of, that opens up another whole set of questions, I think. Thank you very much indeed, everybody. TJ has to run to another call. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Heidi, for your time. And
Thank you, Caroline.
Questions.
Thanks, Caroline.
So yeah, sorry about the audio issues. But great to have everybody on the session. We will be back next week, next Friday, with a general Q&A session. Thank you again, and have a great weekend, everybody.
You too.